Back in 1991, the world watched something that seemed almost impossible. One of the biggest, most experienced armies in the world was completely and utterly taken apart in what felt like the blink of an eye. So, how did it happen? How did the world's fourth largest military collapse in just 100 hours? Let's get into the story of the first Gulf War. So, picture this. On one hand, you have Iraqi President Saddam Hussein promising the world what he called the mother of all battles. And on the other hand, you have the reality, a total military implosion. That massive gap between the promise and the result, that's what we're going to break down. And to understand it, we've got to go back to the very first spark that set the whole Gulf on fire. Right, so before a single shot was fired, before any tanks started rolling, this whole thing really started with money. Let's take a look at the incredible pressure that pushed Saddam Hussein into making a reckless and ultimately a fatal bet. Okay, just try to imagine this. You've just come out of a horrible 8-year-long war. But instead of celebrating, you're staring down this number, $80 billion. That's how much foreign debt Iraq was in by 1990. And to make everything worse, oil prices were in the tank, which basically choked off any hope of an economic recovery. Now, from Saddam's point of view, this wasn't just some unfortunate economic cycle. He genuinely believed that countries like Kuwait and the UAE were keeping oil prices low on purpose. As he saw it, this was a direct attack, a form of economic warfare meant to cripple Iraq when it was at its weakest. So, to build his case and justify what was coming, Saddam started mixing old historical arguments with these new economic complaints. He argued that Kuwait wasn't even a real country, that it was an artificial state that should have been part of Iraq all along. And on top of that, he accused Kuwait of literally stealing Iraqi oil by drilling sideways under the border. These became his big public reasons for aggression. And things escalated fast. I mean, really fast. Most of the world was kind of dismissing it as political posturing, First, 35,000 troops show up at the border, then it jumps to 100,000. And then, suddenly, it wasn't posturing anymore. On August 2nd, Iraqi tanks just rolled right into Kuwait. In 2 days, the entire country was occupied. Saddam was betting that the world would just complain a little and then accept his new reality. He could not have been more wrong. What he did instead was trigger a global reaction that was faster and more unified than almost anyone had ever seen. I mean, just look at this. This wasn't just the US and its usual allies. We're talking 42 different countries. You had major Arab powers like Saudi Arabia and Egypt standing shoulder to shoulder with Western nations. Even the Soviet Union was on board. This was the entire world drawing a line in the sand and saying, no, this will not stand. And this wasn't just talk either. This global agreement led to one of the most incredible military buildups in history, Operation Desert Shield. For months, it was like a non-stop river of military hardware flowing into the region. Saudi ports and airfields were running 24/7, with troops, tanks, planes, and supplies pouring in. A massive, modern army was literally appearing in the middle of the desert. Now, at first, the whole mission was strictly defensive. As President Bush made it super clear, the goal was to protect Saudi Arabia from being next on Saddam's list. And the demand was simple. Iraq had to get out of Kuwait completely and without any conditions. Saddam, for his part, tried every trick in the book to break this alliance apart. He took foreigners hostage, hoping to create leverage. He tried to provoke Israel into the fight, thinking it would make the Arab nations leave the coalition, but it all backfired. The coalition held firm, Israel wisely stayed out, and taking hostages just made the world even more determined. Finally, the UN laid down the law. Get out of Kuwait by January 15th, 1991, or you will be forced out. The deadline came, and the deadline went. Saddam didn't blink. And so, just like that, the mission changed. The defensive buildup, Desert Shield, transformed into the offense, Operation Desert Storm, the campaign to liberate Kuwait by force. The plan, put together by Coalition Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf, was absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. Step 1, for 39 days, just hammer the Iraqi army from the air. Take out their communications, their air defenses, their supply lines, basically blind them and cut them off. Then, step 2, launch a giant ground attack, the famous left hook, not where they expect you, but swinging wide around their flank to attack them from behind. And this right here, this is where the war was really won. The technology gap was just immense. I mean, think about it. Coalition forces could navigate the empty desert at night using GPS. The Iraqis had a map and a compass.
Coalition tanks could see through smoke and darkness using thermal sights. The Iraqis had to see what they were shooting at. It was stealth bombers against old Soviet radar. The coalition was fighting a 21st century war against a 1970s army. They were essentially fighting blind.
So after more than a month of getting pounded from the air, totally cut off and demoralized, the ground war finally kicked off. On February 24th, 500,000 coalition soldiers pushed forward. And the Iraqi frontline troops, most of whom were conscripts who hadn't been fed or supplied properly for weeks, started surrendering in huge numbers. Some parts of the line just completely fell apart, almost instantly. And this quote from a soldier on the ground, it just perfectly sums up the left hook. The Iraqis had dug in all along the southern border, expecting a head-on fight. Instead, this enormous armored force just swung way out into the desert to the west and slammed into them from the side and the rear. Their defenses were all facing the wrong way. It turned their fortified positions into traps they couldn't get out of. As the Iraqi army completely shattered and tried to flee back toward Baghdad, they got caught out in the open on the highways. Coalition aircraft trapped the columns, and the results were devastating. The images from what the media called the Highway of Death were broadcast all over the world, creating huge political pressure on President Bush to call off the attack and end the killing. So the fighting was over, and the victory was, from a purely military standpoint, about as total as it gets. But the peace? Well, that was a whole different and much more complicated story. The end of the war was really just the beginning of a whole new set of problems. Wow. I mean, this chart tells you everything you need to know about how lopsided this conflict was. The sheer technological and tactical dominance of the coalition led to one of the most one-sided victories in modern warfare. The human cost was carried almost entirely by the Iraqi side. And just like that, after precisely 100 hours of ground combat, President Bush went on television and announced it was over. The mission, as it was defined, was accomplished. Kuwait was free, the Iraqi army was defeated, the objectives were met. But this is the decision that would define the next decade and beyond. The coalition stopped, they did not go to Baghdad, they did not remove Saddam Hussein from power, and crucially, this meant that his best, most loyal troops, the Republican Guard, survived the war pretty much intact. And that single decision to stop short of Baghdad led directly to the war's most tragic and difficult legacy. The war's ugliest chapter was actually just about to begin, right after the fighting had stopped. See, people inside Iraq, encouraged by President Bush's statements, thought this was their moment. The Kurds in the north and the Shiites in the south rose up against Saddam's regime. But the coalition forces had orders to stand down, and they basically just watched as Saddam turned his surviving Republican Guard tanks and helicopter gunships on his own people, crushing those rebellions with unbelievable brutality. So the fallout from this was just massive, and it lasted for years. Saddam, of course, stayed in power for another 12 years. The failed uprisings created a massive humanitarian crisis. The retreating Iraqis set over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells on fire, causing an environmental disaster. And a mysterious illness, which became known as Gulf War Syndrome, started affecting hundreds of thousands of veterans who had served there. And all of this leaves us with a really tough question, one that historians still debate today. You have this perfect, almost textbook military victory, a marvel of planning and technology. Was it all completely undermined by the messy, imperfect peace that followed? Did the political decision to stop when they did end up paving the way for even more conflict down the road? It's something to think about.